In the hush before memory, when Ireland was still young beneath the stars, the land lay in twilight. The seas sighed against its edges, and the mist clung low to the hills, as though unwilling to release their secrets. There were no songs then, not of hope, nor of harvest. The Fomorians ruled, a people of shadow and sea storm, whose presence pressed upon every green valley like a weight of iron. Their ships came with the tide and left with tribute, grain, gold, and sorrow. Their laughter echoed across the waves, cruel and hollow, like thunder without rain. Yet even under their dominion life endured. The rivers still wound patiently through the land. The oaks still whispered to one another in the dusk, and somewhere deep within the folds of the world, destiny turned in its sleep. The bards would one day call that turning the dawn of the light, but for now it was only a murmur, a dream carried upon the western wind. Tonight's story is of that dawning, the rise of Lugh the Shining One, whose coming marked the end of darkness. It is a tale as old as sorrow, and as young as the morning sky, of skill and renewal, of light born from the heart of shadow. If this story has brought you a moment of peace, let your support be known with a gentle click to subscribe, and more myths will come to find you. Now, let us begin where the darkness still holds sway, where the sea gods reign and even the stars seem dimmed. Long before the Tuatha Dé Danann, the shining tribe of the goddess Danu, had mastered the arts of craft and magic, the island was under the cold gaze of Balor of the Evil Eye. None could withstand the sight of that eye when it opened, for it burned with death itself, a beam that scorched field and flesh alike. Yet Balor feared something more than all the armies of men or gods, a prophecy. It was said that he would be slain by his own blood, by a child born to his daughter, Ethniu. So fierce was his dread that he locked her in a glass tower on Tory Island, surrounded by guards and storms. There, the wind howled day and night, and the sea broke itself to foam against the rocks. Ethniu grew within that loneliness, as bright and fragile as a flame kept from the world. But fate, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. From the realm of the Tuatha Dé Danann came Cian, a man of cunning and courage, servant to the healer Dian Sect. Through guile and magic he reached the Forbidden Tower, and there he and Ethniu beheld one another, not as enemies kin, but as souls drawn together by the same sorrow, the yearning for freedom. From their union, hidden from all eyes, destiny took its form. When Balor learned that a child had been born, rage filled the sea itself. He commanded that the infant be cast into the depths. Yet even the ocean, ancient and wise, pitied that small spark of life. The waves carried him instead to the shore where Manannán mac Lir, lord of the sea, walked among the tides. Manannán lifted the child and saw the light in his eyes, a brightness that seemed to belong to another world. He wrapped the boy in sea silk and bore him to the land of the gods, to be fostered among the Tuatha Dé Danann. There the child was named Lugh, though some whispered other names. Samildanach, the many-skilled, Lamfada, of the long arm, and once, in a hush of reverence, simply the light. His childhood passed in secrecy, hidden from the gaze of Balor's eye. Yet even as he grew among the gods, the mark of both worlds lay upon him, the shadow of his grandsire's blood and the radiance of his mother's grace. The Tuatha saw the strange harmony in him, sea and sky, storm and sun, darkness and brilliance entwined. He learned swiftly, as if each craft were a song he had always known. Gwibnew the smith taught him the forging of blades, Luchta the wright the shaping of wood, Credan the bronze worker the delicate joining of metals. He learned poetry from Ogma, whose words could move mountains, and healing from Dian Sect, whose hands knew the secret of renewal. From Manannán he learned the tides and the veils between worlds, how to walk unseen when danger stirred. And from the harp of the Dagda he learned the music that binds joy and sorrow into one breath. Years passed, and with each season Lugh grew in grace and strength. His laughter was bright as water over stone, his gaze clear as dawn after rain. Yet often, when night fell and the fires burned low, he would sit apart listening to the distant waves. He could feel it, the pull of something vast and waiting, a darkness that knew his name, for Balor still lived, and his power was great. Across the sea the Fomorians strengthened their hold upon the land. They exacted heavier tributes, drained the joy from every harvest, until even the wind seemed weary. The Tuatha Dé Danann, once radiant in their mastery, had grown dim under that oppression. King Nuada, who had lost his hand in battle, ruled from Tara with a heart heavy with defeat. It was into this silence that Lugh came, a youth with the light of 1,000 dawns behind his eyes. But destiny is never in haste. Before he could stand before kings or face his grandfather's doom, he had to understand the balance of what he was, half shadow, half light, and learn that mastery is not conquest, but harmony. On the eve of his 17th year, he stood upon a cliff overlooking the western sea. The moon shone silver on the water, and the wind moved through his hair like a whisper of forgotten songs. He closed his eyes and felt the breath of both worlds, the cold salt air and the warm pulse of the land beneath his feet. In that stillness he saw, not with sight but with spirit, the shape of what was to come. A spear bright as lightning, an army rising from mist, a dark eye opening upon the world and his own hand poised against it. The vision passed like the breaking of a wave, leaving behind a quiet certainty. He turned then toward the east, where the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. It was not yet light, but the promise of it was enough. And so began the long journey toward destiny, the slow rising of the sun after endless night. The morning that followed was pale and still, the kind of dawn that seems to hold its breath before the day remembers to begin. Lugh descended from the cliffs and crossed the sleeping fields, where mist hung low over the grass, and the dew clung to his boots like tiny stars. Every step he took felt both ordinary and eternal, as though the earth itself recognized him, yet waited to see what kind of light he would become. He did not travel with company, nor did he announce himself as anything more than a youth on the road. The world had not yet learned to say his name with reverence. He carried only a small satchel, a harp, and a sling of polished leather, a simple thing, though its weave was perfect. His foster father, Manannan, had taught him that the worth of a tool lies not in ornament but in mastery, and Lugh's hand was steady upon it, as if it were part of him already. The path wound through quiet valleys where the cattle grazed thinly under the rule of the Fomorians. He saw the marks of their taxation everywhere, fields half-harvested, cottages abandoned, laughter hushed like a song forgotten mid-tune. Yet even in the faces of those he passed, dimmed with weariness, he sensed an ember of endurance. The Tuatha Dé Danann had not fallen into despair. They had only forgotten how to rise. By nightfall he reached a small settlement near the River Boyne. The people there were cautious of strangers, but there was something in his manner, neither boastful nor begging, that softened their suspicion. They offered him bread and a place by the hearth. In return he played them music, his fingers drawing quiet brightness from the harp. The melody was one he had learned from the Dagda himself, a song that carried both sorrow and renewal, as though the strings remembered every season of the world. When he finished, silence lingered, deep and tender. A child near the fire whispered, "It sounds like the sun waking up." Lugh smiled, for that was exactly how it felt. He stayed the night among them, listening to their stories of hardship and fear, how the Fomorians took 1/3 of every harvest, how their overseers came with whips of seaweed and armour crusted with salt. In the morning he left them a charm woven of rushes and sea thread, whispering words of protection over it. "Hang this above your doorway," he said softly. "It will not drive away darkness, but it will remind you that light remembers where you live." From the Boyne, Lugh travelled west toward Tara, the seat of King Nuada. The roads grew steeper, and the air carried the scent of iron and rain. Along the way he encountered wanderers and craftsmen, soldiers and poets, each carrying their own measure of skill or sorrow. He watched them closely, not as a judge but as a student of the world. He spoke with a blacksmith who lamented that the Fomorians took all the bronze, leaving only dull iron for tools, with a healer who confessed that her herbs no longer grew as before, as if the land itself had lost faith. Lugh listened, and from each he learned, not just their craft, but the quiet courage required to keep shaping and healing in a time of oppression. When at last he saw Tara rising from the hills, it was as if the sky itself lifted. The great hall stood ringed by ancient stones, and banners hung listlessly in the breeze, faded by rain and years of uneasy rule. The guards at the gate crossed their spears before him. "Who comes to Tara?" one asked, his voice worn but not unkind. "A traveller," Lugh said, "bearing gifts of craft and counsel." The guards looked at his plain cloak and the harp slung across his back. One smirked. "Gifts, you say? We have poets enough, and smiths, and warriors too, though none of them prosper under Fomorian tribute. What else could you offer the High King?" "Let me speak with him," Lugh said, "and I will tell you." They laughed quietly, but something in his gaze, clear as the horizon after rain, made them pause. They let him pass, though one muttered to the other, "He'll not last a minute before the gatekeeper turns him away." Inside the great hall, the air was thick with the scent of peat smoke and defeat. Nuada sat upon his throne of silver, his left arm of flesh and his right of shining metal, a gift of Goibniu the smith. Around him gathered the lords of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Ogma the poet-warrior, Dianzecht the healer, and others whose names were once spoken with reverence but now only with weary duty. At the door stood the gatekeeper, an elder with eyes like polished stone. "No one enters unless they bring a skill the court lacks," he declared, echoing the ancient law of Tara. "I understand," said Lugh. "Tell me, what skills are within?" The gatekeeper named them one by one. A poet, a harper, a smith, a craftsman, a champion, a healer, a sorcerer, a historian. "And if I possessed all those arts?" Lugh asked quietly. The gatekeeper frowned. "None can claim such breadth." "Then let me try," Lugh said, "and if I speak false, turn me away." Intrigued, the elder summoned the court's poet Ogma, who challenged him to recite the ancient lays. Lugh spoke them perfectly, his voice like wind through silver reeds. Then the harper came, and Lugh's fingers danced upon the strings until even the embers in the hearth seemed to pulse with life. One by one they tested him. Goibniu the smith marvelled at his forge work, Dianzecht nodded at his knowledge of herbs, and Nuada himself found in the youth's words both wisdom and courage. When the trials were done, the hall was hushed. The gatekeeper, humbled, turned to the High King. "This one is Samildanach," he said softly, "master of all crafts." Nuada regarded Lugh for a long moment. The king's eyes, silver-grey like the mists of Connaught, reflected both sorrow and dawning hope. "You have many gifts," he said, "but tell me, why do you come?" Lugh bowed slightly. "I come because the land grows weary of shadows. I come because skill must serve more than survival. I come because I was born to stand where darkness believes it reigns." In the silence that followed, even the fire seemed to lean toward him. Nuada's voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "Then perhaps the prophecy walks among us." From that day, Lugh was admitted into the council of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Yet not all were quick to trust him. Some whispered that his brilliance was arrogance, that no one should hold mastery in so many arts. But Lugh bore their doubts with calm grace, offering help rather than argument. To the healers, he brought new herbs from the western cliffs. To the smiths, new alloys gleaned from the secrets of seastone. In every act he sought not glory but renewal. And still, far across the grey waters, Balor stirred. Word of a youth of radiant skill reached even his dark court upon Tory Island. The old giant's eye throbbed beneath its lid, a pulse of unease. "My blood," he muttered, "my doom walks the earth." The sea wind howled through his tower, and the waves struck the cliffs below like the beating of a giant heart. Meanwhile, at Tara, the days began to change. The hall seemed brighter, laughter less fragile. The gods themselves felt something returning, a breath they had forgotten to take. But light never rises without awakening its shadow, and the darkness across the sea had begun to gather its strength. Days lengthened, and the hills of Ireland began to breathe again. The mists lifted earlier, and even the crows seemed less like omens, and more like keepers of old secrets. At Tara, the fires burned brighter in the evenings. Poets spoke again without trembling. The smiths' forges rang clear into the night. Yet beneath all this gentle renewal, the weight of fate was drawing taut, unseen as the tide beneath calm waters. Lugh, though welcome among the Tuatha Dé Danann, felt the currents shifting. The High King Nuada trusted him, but others watched from shadowed corners, some with envy, some with fear. Ogma, the great poet-warrior, admired his skill but tested his spirit. The Dagda, Lord of Abundance, regarded him with the slow wisdom of the earth itself, and Bress, the deposed Fomorian king, who still lingered in disgrace, studied him in silence, his eyes dark with old resentment. Each day Lugh applied his craft not to conquest, but to renewal. He taught the smiths how to forge tools that would not corrode beneath salt air. He worked beside the healers, learning the hidden music of the body, how breath and heartbeat formed the rhythm of recovery. To the bards he spoke of truth as more than beauty, a kind of binding between word and world. Slowly, Tara began to hum again with purpose. But destiny is not patient forever. One night, as rain whispered against the thatch and the hearth burned low, a messenger came to Tara, ragged, half drowned, his eyes wide with fear. "The Fomorians come again," he gasped. "Their ships darken the western sea. They demand double tribute or promise ruin." The hall fell into uneasy silence. King Nuada rose, his silver hand glinting in the firelight. "We have no tribute left to give," he said. "Only our pride, and that they cannot take." Lugh stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, the shadows from the flames flickering across his face. He did not speak at once. His thoughts were deep as still water. At last he said, "Then it is time we remembered who we are. We are the people of Danu, who came from the northern isles bearing wisdom and art. We are not born to serve darkness." Ogma turned toward him. "You speak as though you would challenge them yourself." Lugh's eyes shone softly. "If I must. But no victory comes from one hand alone. The gods of craft must stand together, each art serving the other. The spear cannot win without the song to guide it, nor can healing follow if we forget compassion in the fight." Nuada regarded him long, and then nodded. "Then speak, Lugh of the Long Arm. Tell us what must be done." So Lugh spoke through the night, weaving plan and purpose like threads of gold through shadow. He spoke of unity, of each god and craft finding its rightful place. The smiths would forge anew, the poets would rekindle courage, and the healers would ready their herbs for the wounded to come. But beyond all this, he told them of something deeper, a vision that had come to him on the cliffside years ago, of a battle not of hatred but of balance. "For the Fomorians are not only darkness," he said softly. "They are the other side of our light, the sea to our sky. To destroy them utterly would be to tear the fabric of the world, but their dominion must end, for the sun cannot live forever beneath the wave." A murmur passed through the hall, some awed, some uneasy. Lugh's words carried the strange calm of prophecy, and even those who doubted could not easily look away. At dawn, messengers were sent to every stronghold of the Tuatha Dé Danann. For the first time in a generation, the tribes prepared not for tribute but for resistance. Days turned to weeks, and Tara thrummed with motion. Goibniu's forge roared like thunder. He shaped weapons so perfect they never missed their mark. Credne crafted fittings that gleamed like sunlight, and Luchta shaped shields light as willow and strong as oak. The Dagda summoned the bounty of the earth, filling granaries and storehouses. The Morrigan herself was seen walking the battlefields before they were fought, her eyes dark with foresight. Through it all, Lugh moved quietly among them, not a commander but a flame that kindled others to burn brighter. He worked beside the smiths, his hands blackened with soot. He sang with the poets as they practiced words to steady hearts. He trained with the warriors, his spear gleaming like dawn itself. At times, when night fell and silence returned, he would walk alone beyond the walls. The sky stretched vast above him, the stars cold and countless. He could feel the pulse of the world, slow, ancient, waiting. Often he thought of his mother, Ethniu, whose face he had never seen, and of Balor, whose shadow still stretched across the sea. He wondered what it meant to be born of both. Light and darkness within one body, one spirit. Was he truly destined to destroy, or merely to transform? The sea answered only with its eternal rhythm, neither promise nor denial. Then came a day when the horizon itself changed. From the cliffs of the western coast watchers saw sails, dark as storm clouds, vast and many. The Fomorian fleet had come. At Tara the horns of assembly sounded. Warriors gathered, armour gleaming faintly in the sun. The Tuatha Dé Danann stood ready, their hearts steady but heavy. Lugh walked among them, calm as the morning tide. Before the march began, Nuada called him to the sacred hill. "You have brought us to this hour," the king said, "but know this, Lugh of the Long Arm. Prophecy is a blade with two edges. You may bring dawn, or burn with it." Lugh bowed his head. "If the light consumes me, let it be for the world's awakening." They clasped hands, silver and flesh. And then the march began. Across the plains they went, banners rippling like rivers of colour, green, gold, and silver. The sound of their steps was like rain on distant stone. From every hilltop the people watched, hope trembling in their throats like birds afraid to sing. At the edge of the sea they halted, for the Fomorian host had landed. The sky darkened with their arrival, and the air grew heavy as though the sun itself faltered. Giants strode from the waves, their armour encrusted with coral and barnacle, their eyes gleaming like wet stones. At their head rode Balor, vast and terrible, his one great eye covered with a heavy lid, bound by chains of iron. Even through its covering the air shimmered with the heat of its power. Lugh stood upon a rise, his spear in hand, his heart still. He felt no hatred, only an immense stillness, as if every moment of his life had drawn him to this breath. Around him the Tuatha formed their ranks, each god and hero ready in their place. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt and storm. Then Lugh raised his voice, not loud but clear, a note of sunlight through gathering cloud. "Let this be not the end, but the turning," he said, "for every shadow cast is proof that light endures." And as the first clash of steel rang across the plain, the dawn broke fully over the hills, bright and terrible and beautiful. The light came softly at first, thin as breath, silver across the grass. It touched the spearheads of the Tuatha Dé Danann, glimmered on their shields, and trembled upon the faces of those who stood between despair and destiny. A mist hung low over the battlefield, veiling the meeting of two worlds. To the west the Fomorian host loomed dark and immense, their bodies scaled and barnacled from the deeps, their weapons glistening with salt and seaweed. The scent of brine and iron thickened the air. For a long moment there was no sound but the shifting wind. The Morrigan stood apart upon a black rock, her hair wild as storm surf, her eyes fixed upon the horizon. She said nothing. Her silence was the silence before the cry of fate. Lugh walked among his people, his step unhurried, his gaze steady. The Tuatha watched him, as one might watch the first ray of sunlight after endless night, not in worship, but in remembering what light felt like. He carried his spear in one hand, its haft smooth and alive beneath his fingers, its tip faintly radiant with contained fire. The weapon was said to hunger for battle, but Lugh had learned to master it, as a harpist tames a note to sweetness. At last, Balor's voice broke the stillness. It was deep and rough as the ocean's undercurrent, carrying across the plain like the groan of shifting stone. "So," he said, "the child of prophecy walks, my daughter's shame, my own blood come to undo me." Lugh raised his head, and his voice came back calm and clear, unstraining. "Not to undo, old one, to awaken." Balor's laughter rolled like thunder over the waves. "Awaken? You know not what you speak, boy. The sea sleeps for none, it takes, it devours, and when your bones lie beneath it, you will see that darkness is all the light there ever was." But Lugh only smiled faintly. "Then I will show you what lies beyond even the sea." The mist shifted, horns sounded, deep, resonant, echoing off the hillsides. The Tuatha Dé Danann moved as one. From Gibnew's forge the blades shone like stars reborn. Ogma strode forward, his sword gleaming with the light of speech itself, every strike a word of power. The Dagda's great club, vast as a fallen oak, swept through the Fomorian ranks like a storm wind through reeds. Yet Lugh saw not chaos, but a rhythm, the rise and fall of life's breath, the turning of the tide. In the noise of battle he heard the heartbeat of the world, steady, patient, eternal. He moved through that vast motion with a grace beyond reckoning. Wherever he passed, the Tuatha took heart. Their wounds closed quicker, their arms steadied. His presence was like the calm in the eye of the storm, the stillness around which fury turns. Balor's forces pressed hard, their shadows thick and cold. They fought with the strength of the sea itself, surging and receding in waves that battered the golden line of the gods. But Lugh had learned the sea too. He flowed with their rhythm, drawing them outward, letting their weight spend itself against his calm. At his side the Morrigan cried out, a wild, fierce sound that sent a tremor through friend and foe alike. Her voice rose over the clash of bronze and bone, a call not of despair, but of transformation. Crows swirled above her like fragments of a breaking night, and still Balor waited. He sat upon a chariot wrought of iron and bone, his lid still closed over the dreadful eye. When it opened, the legend said, no living thing could survive its gaze. His warriors shouted for him to unleash it, but Balor only watched the field, his great hand resting upon the chain that bound the lid. Lugh felt the pull of that gaze even before it opened, the gravity of death, the weight of inevitability. He knew this was the moment his life had been shaped toward, every lesson, every loss, every breath. He signalled to his allies to fall back. Confusion rippled through the ranks, but they obeyed, trusting the calm that surrounded him like sunlight through morning mist. Slowly he began to walk toward Balor, each step measured, each breath deep. The world seemed to narrow until there was only the two of them, the youth and the ancient dawn and storm. Even the wind fell silent. The sea itself paused its breath. Balor's voice came low, like distant thunder. So you come alone, child? Lugh's tone was gentle. Light always stands alone, at the edge of night. Then you shall be the first to vanish. With that, Balor drew the chain. The iron clanked and the lid rose. A brilliance of darkness poured forth, so intense it seemed to consume the light around it. Grass withered, stone cracked, the very air turned to flame. The soldiers nearby fell where they stood, their armour melting like wax. The eye of Balor opened fully and the world trembled, but Lugh did not falter. He stood still, letting that terrible gaze meet his. His own eyes reflected its black fire, and within them another light began to grow, a radiance neither gold nor white, but the colour of balance itself, the hue of dawn caught between night and day. He raised his sling, slow as sunrise. In his palm the stone gleamed, a gift from the forge of Goibniu, smooth and perfect. He whispered to it, not words of war, but of release. Then, with the ease of breath, he set it to flight. The stone whirled through the air, singing softly, and struck Balor's brow just above the monstrous eye. For an instant the darkness flared, then folded inward, collapsing like a dying star. Balor's body swayed, immense and ancient, before falling with a sound like the breaking of ages. The earth shuddered beneath him, and the sea drew back in awe. When the silence came, it was vast. The clouds parted. The sun poured over the battlefield gentle and gold. The surviving Fomorians fell to their knees, their weapons forgotten. The Tuatha Dé Danann stood still, breathing the strange light that now filled the air. Lugh lowered his sling and knelt beside the fallen giant. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly he placed his hand upon Balor's brow. "You were the shadow I needed to see," he murmured. "Rest now. The world is wide enough for both light and memory." He closed the lid of the terrible eye. The air grew calm. The sea, as if in respect, whispered softly against the shore. When Lugh rose, the sun stood higher than it had in a generation. The light touched the faces of his kin, and tears ran freely, of relief, of wonder, of a grief they could not name. For though they had one, they understood that something immense had passed out of the world, something necessary in its own dark way. That night, the fires burned high across the hills. The Tuatha celebrated their freedom, yet even in their joy there was reverence. Songs were sung not of conquest, but of renewal. The Morrigan walked the fields in silence, gathering the fallen, whispering blessings to both sides, and Lugh, the Shining One, sat alone upon the hill overlooking the sea. The stars were bright above him, their reflection trembling in the waters below. He felt the weight of his victory not as triumph, but as awakening. The knowledge that dawn, once risen, must also one day fade, that even light must learn gentleness if it is to endure. He watched the waves roll in, endless, tireless, and whispered into the night, "Let the world remember balance." The sea gave no answer, but the air felt lighter, as though it had heard. The days that followed were like slow exhalations after years of held breath. Ireland, long shadowed beneath the dominion of the Fomorians, awoke as though from troubled sleep. The sky seemed clearer, the air lighter, and the rivers ran freer to the sea. For a time even the gulls flew higher, their cries no longer mournful but like laughter returning to the world. At Tara, the High King Nuada called his people together, not for war but for peace. The great hall was adorned with garlands of rowan and oak, symbols of protection and renewal. Harpers played softly in the corners, their notes gentle as dawnlight through mist. The Tuatha Dé Danann gathered not in armour now, but in robes and cloaks of woven green and silver. The scent of fresh bread and honey filled the air. When Lugh entered, the hall rose to greet him. Yet he moved with no pride, only quiet composure, his step slow as the tide. He carried no weapon, only the harp that had once stilled fear among weary hearts. Its strings glimmered faintly, as if remembering both battle and peace. Nuada, his silver hand gleaming beneath torchlight, stood before his throne. "You have done what none could," he said. "You have restored light to the land, and with it, hope. Tell me, Lugh Lamfada, what do you ask in return?" Lugh bowed his head. "Only that the light be tended, not worshipped. It is not mine to keep, but all of ours to share." A murmur of assent passed through the hall. The Dagda smiled broadly, his laughter deep as earth. "Then let the land remember joy," he said, and struck his harp so that its notes rippled through every heart like sunlight across a lake. For 7 days and nights the Tuatha celebrated. They feasted beneath open skies, danced upon the grass until the dew rose around their feet, and told stories of the days before shadow. Yet even amid their joy, Lugh remained thoughtful. Often he would step away from the revels, walking the quiet fields beyond Tara, listening to the wind move through the barley. The land spoke in whispers, and he listened. He had ended the tyranny of the Fomorians, but within him the question remained. What does light do once the darkness withdraws? The answer, he sensed, was not in triumph, but in tending, in guiding the world toward balance. On the 8th morning, when the sky blushed with the first gold of dawn, the Morrigan came to him. She walked barefoot through the dew, her dark hair loose, her expression softer than the legends would have believed possible. "The land breathes again," she said quietly, "but breath is fragile. What will you do with your peace, Shining One?" Lugh looked toward the rising sun, its warmth gentle upon his face. "Peace is not stillness," he said. "It is a current that must be kept in motion lest it stagnate. I will go among the people. I will teach them the crafts that strengthen, not the weapons that destroy." The Morrigan nodded. "So the warrior becomes the teacher." "Perhaps he always was," he said with a faint smile. In the weeks that followed, Lugh travelled across Ireland. Wherever he went, he brought with him not commands, but knowledge. In the valleys, he taught farmers the cycles of the seasons, how to read the wind and soil, how to plant not only for harvest, but for harmony with the land. In the forges, he worked beside smiths, showing them how to temper their metals so that tools outlasted their makers. To the healers, he revealed the secret songs of renewal, melodies that could draw balance back into broken bodies. He sat with poets by twilight fires, teaching them that words could heal as deeply as herbs. "A poem," he said, "is not for praise alone. It is a vessel of memory, so that no soul need walk in darkness unremembered." Wherever he lingered, laughter began to return. Children played in the fields again, unafraid of the sea's horizon. Songs of harvest rose where once only silence lived, and yet always the people sensed in Lugh a stillness, a quiet awareness that joy was a fragile guest, to be welcomed with humility. One evening, as he crossed the Shannon, he came upon an old man mending a fishing net by the shore. The man looked up, his face worn but kind. "I know you," he said, though his eyes were clouded. "You're the one they call the Shining," Lugh smiled. "Only light enough to see by." The man chuckled softly. "Light enough is plenty. But tell me, do you never tire? The world may never cease needing you." Lugh sat beside him, watching the river move in silver threads through the reeds. If light burned endlessly, it would blind the world, so even the sun must rest. They spoke no more, but the silence between them was warm, like the hush of dusk before the stars wake. Seasons turned, the scars of battle healed, the fields grew full again, the herds fattened, the rivers ran clear. Children born after the fall of Balor grew without memory of fear, and the stories of the dark days became tales for winter fires, less pain than lesson. But Lugh, though beloved, began to sense a change. The world no longer trembled between extremes. Light had steadied. Balance, once hard won, now simply was. And as the balance held, the call within him began to soften. He felt the turning of his purpose, the slow unwinding that comes to all who have fulfilled their thread of fate. One twilight, as he watched the sun sink beyond the western hills, he felt a quiet ache, not sorrow, but the deep recognition that all dawns must one day yield to dusk. The world did not need his brilliance now, it needed his gentleness. That night, in his sleep, he dreamed of the sea. Not as storm or foe, but as shimmering calm, waves folding upon one another in infinite patience. A voice spoke within the sound, low and kind, like tide against stone. Light and shadow are not enemies, my child. They are dancers who take turns leading. He woke before dawn, the dream, still warm in his heart. And as the first light touched the horizon, Lugh knew his path was turning again, not toward battle or even rule, but toward remembrance. He would not vanish from the world, but he would step quietly into its fabric, becoming less a man than a melody woven into the living land. For light, when its work is done, does not depart. It lingers, gentler than breath, within all it has touched. And so began the Age of Peace, the long summer of Ireland, where skill and song thrived, and every craft was a prayer of gratitude. The gods walked among the people not as rulers, but as kin. The Tuatha Dé Danann became the keepers of art and learning, unseen yet near, their presence felt in every wellspring, every grove, every whispered inspiration at the edge of sleep. And Lugh, the Shining One, watched over it all, not from a throne, but from the quiet places where light meets leaf, where the river bends toward the sea, where a craftsman's hands move with love and care. Years uncoiled like threads of gold, soft and slow, until the memory of battle became a faint echo behind the murmur of rivers and the rhythm of seasons. The Tuatha Dé Danann thrived in that new age, their work spreading through the land like sunlight through a forest. Peace had texture again, woven from laughter, toil, and the low hum of living things returning to their rightful balance. And yet, as always, peace carries its own kind of silence, a stillness so deep it begins to ask questions. Lugh felt it first not in the world around him, but within himself. He would stand some mornings upon the eastern cliffs, watching the mist rise off the sea, and feel in the cool wind the faint whisper of change. It was not sorrow, nor warning, only the quiet knowledge that the world does not hold still, even for its brightest moments. He had done what he was born to do. He had ended the reign of shadow, brought the dawn, and taught harmony to those who once knew only struggle. Yet as the people grew wise and self-sufficient, as the gods themselves grew content in their peace, Lugh began to feel less like a flame and more like an ember, steady but dimming. He did not resist it. Even light must learn to rest. When he walked among the people now, they no longer trembled in reverence. They smiled, offered him bread or cider, spoke to him as they would to a friend. He preferred it so. Divinity meant nothing if it did not warm the hearts it touched. He lingered in workshops and gardens by wells and firesides, speaking softly of skill, of patience, of balance. In a small village near the river Suir, he helped a young woman mend her loom. Her name was Breed, and her hands were quick but uncertain. The warp kept slipping, the thread breaking before the pattern could form. "Too much haste," he said gently, crouching beside her. "The thread is alive. It listens when you rush." She frowned, biting her lip. "Then how am I to finish before the festival?" "By beginning again," he said, "not with your hands, but with your breath. Weave as the world weaves, one moment at a time." She exhaled slowly, and he guided her fingers. Together they worked until the sun fell, and when they were done, the pattern on the cloth shone faintly in the lamplight, a design of interlocking spirals like light meeting shadow. She smiled then, the shy, astonished smile of one who has seen her own strength. Lugh returned her smile, and as he did, something stirred in him, a small joy, almost forgotten. This, he thought, was the truest craft. Not the making of grand weapons or miracles, but the kindling of confidence in another soul. When he left that village, dawn was breaking over the fields. The air smelled of wet grass and new beginnings. He walked eastward, following the light as he always had. As the years passed, he travelled farther, through Ulster's green hills, across the stone circles of Connaught, into the deep woods of Munster. He came to know the secret songs of every part of Ireland, the pulse of its earth, the hidden laughter of its streams. The land itself seemed to hum with gratitude. But in the west, beyond the cliffs of Donegal, a change began to stir in the sea. Storms gathered more often now, not of wrath, but of renewal. The Fomorians, though broken, had not vanished. They lingered beneath the waves, their dominion softened but not erased, their voices rising now and then in the language of tides. Lugh would sometimes stand at the shoreline and listen to them, a sound like mourning, like memory. and he would answer not with anger, but with song. His harp would carry across the water, low and clear, weaving his light into their endless dark. It was said that even the waves gentled when they heard him. One evening, while he played upon a headland overlooking the sea, Manannán mac Lir appeared beside him, not in thunder or spray, but as a figure woven of mist and light, his eyes bright with the colour of horizons. "My foster son," said the Sea Lord, his voice calm as the tide, "you have mended much, yet the world turns still. Have you felt it?" Lugh nodded. "The stillness grows heavy. The people are strong now, they have no need of gods in their midst. And the gods themselves, some begin to fade into myth." Manannán smiled faintly. "And is that not as it should be? The tide comes, the tide goes. To linger too long is to defy the rhythm." "I know," Lugh said quietly, "but I would see it endure. A world where skill and harmony hold more power than fear." "Then trust that it will," Manannán said. "You are not leaving them in darkness. You have lit 1,000 small suns, and they will not all fade at once." The wind shifted, carrying salt and memory. Lugh felt a strange warmth, not of flame, but of belonging. "Will you take me when it's time?" he asked softly. Manannán looked out to sea. "When the final dusk comes for you, the waves will know. They will rise gentle and carry you westward. But not yet, bright one. The world still dreams your name." And with that, he was gone, his form dissolving into sea mist, leaving behind only the whisper of water upon stone. Lugh stood for a long time after, the harp quiet against his shoulder. He watched the horizon until night deepened, and the stars revealed themselves like scattered embers of the dawn that once was. He thought of balance, the endless weaving of shadow and light, sorrow and joy, beginning and ending. For the first time, he understood that even gods are threads in that weave. Their purpose is not to rule, but to ensure that the pattern continues. From that night forward, he walked less among cities and more among wild places, mountains, bogs, and forest glades, where the air carried no human sound. In those quiet reaches he found peace not in adoration, but in anonymity. Sometimes travellers glimpsed him at twilight, a tall figure with golden hair, playing a harp whose notes shimmered like starlight on water. Those who heard said that the music left them changed, lighter, braver, more alive. They would return home with a new patience in their work, a new tenderness in their words. And so his legend deepened, not as a god who ruled, but as a presence that guided unseen, like the quiet strength in a craftsman's hand or the courage behind a healer's breath. The Tuatha Dé Danann too began to withdraw, not in sorrow, but in grace. They faded gently into the hidden realms, choosing to dwell beneath the hills and lakes, where the world of men and the world of wonder could touch without colliding. Their light became the shimmer that dances at the edge of vision, the sudden hush in a forest clearing, the feeling of being watched by something kind and old. And in the midst of that slow vanishing, Lugh lingered still, half within, half without, neither fully divine nor wholly mortal. His work was not yet done, though he knew now it would never truly end. For wherever skill met care, wherever dawn followed a dark night, there he would be, the quiet certainty that light, once kindled, never dies. The seasons moved as gently as tides, and the land ripened under the quiet hand of peace. In the mornings, mist still clung to the meadows, soft and silver, and the cry of curlews rose from the river valleys. The people of Ireland went about their days with a steadiness born not of fear, but of rhythm. They sowed, they reaped, they built, they healed, and in all their labours there lingered a faint remembrance of something vast and golden that had once walked among them. Lugh watched from afar, sometimes from the crest of a hill, other times from the shadowed edge of a glen. He no longer needed to stand in sunlight to be light itself. His presence had grown subtler, like warmth felt through a closed door, like music remembered rather than heard. He did not mourn this lessening. It was the way of all things to pass from form into echo. Yet now and then he longed, not for glory or power, but for touch, for voice, for the closeness of those who still lived and changed while he drifted between worlds. One evening, as dusk pooled in the hollows of the land, he walked through a meadow where the air smelled of heather and rain. The first stars were appearing, trembling faintly in the violet sky. He came upon a small gathering of villagers around a fire. They were young, farmers, weavers, a shepherd or two. and their laughter mingled with the crackle of flame. He stood a little way off listening. They were telling a story. His story. Or rather a softened version of it shaped by retelling. And when the Shining One slew the dark giant, the sun came back to the world, a girl was saying. But he didn't stay, did he? He walked west and vanished into the light itself. A boy shook his head. My grandmother says he'll return when the land grows shadowed again, when we've forgotten how to craft and how to care. The girl laughed softly. Then he'll be waiting a long while, won't he? Look around, everything's fine now. They all smiled at that, though something in the boy's eyes held a flicker of uncertainty, as if he knew how fragile fine could be. Lugh stepped closer, the grass barely stirring beneath his feet. Tell me, he said gently, his voice carrying like a breeze across still water. What would you do if he did return? The circle fell silent. The firelight caught their startled faces young and open. I'd ask him, said the girl after a moment, why he left. Lugh smiled, though they could not see it for what it was. A god's tenderness folded into human warmth. Perhaps he never truly did, he said. Perhaps he walks where his story is spoken. The boy leaned forward, squinting into the dusk. You speak like a bard. Only one who remembers, said Lugh, and memory is the oldest craft of all. They offered him a place by the fire, and he sat with them a while listening to their songs. They sang not of war now, but of harvest, of homecomings, of love, that endured the passing of years. The melodies were simple, but they carried the strength of roots. When they asked if he would play, he drew from beneath his cloak a small harp of ash wood and silver. Its sound was unlike anything they had heard. Low, luminous, and woven with the hush of dawn. He played not to astonish, but to soothe. Each note fell like dew upon tired hearts. The villagers leaned close, eyes half closed, as though the world itself had grown gentle enough to rest in. When the last note faded, none spoke for a long time. Then the girl said softly, It feels as if I've heard that song before, in a dream. Lugh nodded. You have. We all have. He left before dawn, walking east into the lightening sky. When the villagers woke, they found only the faint imprint of footsteps in the dew and a single feather of pale gold where he had sat. As he journeyed onward, he thought of their laughter, their ease. It was enough. Perhaps this was how gods should live, not above their people, but within the stories that sustained them. Time turned, and centuries drifted past like leaves upon a stream. The Tuatha Dé Danann, once radiant and near, retreated further into the hidden realms, until the world of men and the world of magic lay apart, touching only in moments of wonder. Yet the old ways endured, in the crafts, in the songs, in the reverence given to hill and well and river. And always, in every telling, Lugh remained, the Shining One, the many-skilled, the light that learns humility. Now and then, he would walk the earth again, unseen but felt, in the forge where a smith's hammer found perfect rhythm, in the field where a farmer lifted his eyes to greet the dawn, in the hush before a healer's hands began their work. There he would be, breathing quietly through their patience. But the world, as worlds do, began to change. The peace he had kindled ripened into abundance, and abundance, unguarded, bred complacency. Craft became competition, wisdom, pride. The people still sang, but their songs grew hurried, their hands restless. They built great halls and glittering vessels, yet in their striving they forgot the gentleness that had once guided their making. Lugh saw this, and felt no anger, only sadness. He knew it for what it was, the eternal turning of the wheel. Each age, bright or dark, rises, fulfills itself, and fades. Still, when the land began to tremble once more under the weight of greed and neglect, he felt a stirring deep within his being, a faint call like the echo of his own name carried upon distant wind. He rose from the quiet hills where he had rested and looked to the horizon. The sea was dark that evening, its surface rippling with shadow. In the west, clouds gathered, dense and heavy, as if the world itself were holding its breath again. He knew then that light would always be called back, not to rule, but to remind. He whispered into the twilight, If they forget, I will return, not as flame, but as the calm that follows it. The wind carried his words across the fields, over rivers and stones, through the doors of sleeping houses. Somewhere, in a dream, a child stirred and saw a man made of light standing upon the shore, watching the sea. The child did not fear him. She smiled and said, "I remember you." And in her dream the Shining One smiled back. Long years turned, slow and quiet as the wheeling stars, and the memory of the Shining One softened into legend. His name was whispered not in temples but in kitchens, by mothers soothing restless children when the wind cried around the eaves. The old stories had lost their sharpness, worn smooth by love and repetition, until they felt less like tales of gods and more like truths of the heart. That courage and craft are kin, that dawn always returns. Lugh watched as the world grew denser with time, villages swelling into towns, fields tamed into patterns, the wild edges trimmed back. The Tuatha Dé Danann had passed wholly into myth now, and he moved unseen through a land that had forgotten the taste of wonder, though not its hunger. He felt it everywhere, in the weary eyes of the shepherd staring at his sheep beneath the same ancient stars, in the slow songs of fishermen whose nets pulled more memory than fish, in the hands of craftsmen who worked still, though they no longer named what guided their skill. He lingered among them quietly. To those who saw him at all, he seemed only another traveller, a man with wind in his hair and calm in his gaze, a voice that could turn fear to stillness. He spoke little, but when he did, it was often to remind rather than to teach. "Take your time," he would tell a mason carving a keystone. "The stone will remember if you hurry." "Rest when the day does," he would murmur to a shepherd falling asleep by his fire. "Even light must fade to be reborn." They never guessed who he was, yet they carried his words long after he left, like embers cupped in their palms. One winter, he came to a monastery that had grown beside a river once sacred to Danu. The monks there copied ancient texts in careful, glowing script, their candles trembling in the cold air. They welcomed him as a stranger seeking warmth. That night, as snow fell beyond the walls, one of them, a young man with ink-stained fingers, spoke hesitantly. "We write of the old gods," he said, "to preserve the stories, though we no longer believe them. But there are moments," he hesitated, eyes on the flame, "when I write the name Lugh, I feel the world grow bright, as if it remembers itself." Lugh smiled faintly, then believed that feeling, not the forgetting. The monk looked up sharply. "Do you think the old gods still walk the earth?" "They never left," said Lugh, "so long as kindness keeps its shape." Later, when the man looked up again, the traveller was gone. But in the margin of his manuscript, where his quill had rested, a small line of gold light shimmered, fading slowly like breath on glass. So it went, year after year, Lugh moving unseen through the changing world, leaving no mark but the quiet strengthening of those who crossed his path. His radiance was tempered now, woven into the fabric of life rather than cast above it. Yet even in that humility, he remained the balance between striving and grace. He would sometimes sit beside rivers that once echoed with his people's laughter. Their voices were gone, but the water still sang the same note beneath. He would close his eyes, listening. The sound was not sorrow. It was continuity. Every current a memory, every ripple a promise that nothing made in love truly disappears. One evening, as he sat thus by a lake in Connaught, the wind rose from the west. It carried with it a familiar scent, salt and distance, the sea calling home its child. He looked up and saw the horizon burn faintly with sunset, the same hue as the fire that had shone in Balor's eye long ago, but it no longer threatened. It was gentled now, transformed into beauty. "Manannan," he whispered. The air shimmered, and the Sea Lord appeared, not as a figure this time, but as a reflection across the water, each wave catching the outline of his face. His voice came low and kind. "The tide turns again, bright one. The world is ready to dream without you." Lugh watched the rippling image, his heart calm. "So soon?" Manannan's laughter was soft as foam. "Soon. You have walked more lifetimes than stars can count. You have sown light enough to last 1,000 dawns. Come now, the sea remembers your name." Lugh rose, brushing the grass from his cloak. Around him twilight deepened, the sky bruised with violet and rose. The first stars flickered awake, each one seeming to bow in farewell. "I have no throne to leave," he said quietly, "only this land." "And that is enough," the sea replied. "You gave it balance, not dominion. That is the rarest gift of all." He walked then toward the western shore, his footsteps silent. As he neared the coast, the waves grew calm, as though the whole ocean held its breath in greeting. The gulls wheeled above him, white arcs in the dimming light. When he reached the water's edge, he paused. The air was full of memory, voices of the Tuatha, laughter of mortals, the hum of time itself. He felt no sadness, only completion. Then, far out upon the horizon, a light appeared, not harsh like noon, but soft, like dawn seen through tears. It shimmered across the waves, golden and patient. Lugh stepped forward. The sea rose to meet him, not as storm but as embrace. Water folded around him like silk, and the light drew nearer until it seemed to become part of him. For a heartbeat he turned and looked back, at the hills, the rivers, the sleeping villages. The world glowed faintly, as if every hearth-fire and star and soul held a spark of his essence. He smiled, and his voice drifted across the waves. "Keep it well." Then the sea closed over him, and the horizon brightened, not with flame, but with serenity. In the centuries that followed, no one saw him again in form. But when dawn breaks clear after a long night of rain, when craftsmen find grace in their labour, when a song rises from heartache into hope, there he is, and somewhere, in the deep calm beneath the surface of things, the Shining One sleeps, his light diffused into all that endures. The sea kept him for an age, and the age stretched like a sigh, too soft to end. Beneath the waves he rested, not in darkness, but in that living twilight where light is slower, deeper, where it lingers in layers, never lost. The waters rocked him as though he were a child again in Manannan's arms. Time there was not as it is upon the land. It moved like a breath, in and out without measure. And yet the world above continued to turn. Seasons came and went. Generations built and broke and built again. The voices of mortals changed, their tongues reshaping the old names into sounds that echoed faintly of their origins. Lugh became Lugh, became whispers that clung to place. Lugh's fort, Lugh's hill, the town of light. They did not know they still spoke him, yet his memory glowed through their syllables like an ember through ash. Sometimes in midsummer, when the sun stood highest and the air trembled with heat, the people would gather without knowing why. They would dance, feast, race their horses upon the plains. They called it the Festival of Lugnasad. Some said it was for the harvest, some for the turning of the year. None remembered that it was once for him, that long ago he had made that feast to honour his foster mother Tailtiu, who died bringing fertility to the soil. Yet even without remembrance, the rhythm endured. From his rest beneath the waves, Lugh felt it. Each year a pulse like a heartbeat through the bones of the world. He smiled in his sleep. Memory, he realized, does not need to be spoken to survive. It only needs to be lived. But the world was changing in ways even the gods had not foreseen. The songs of metal and flame returned, not in war this time, but in industry. The people learned to bend the world's bones to their will. They drew iron from the deep earth, turned rivers into power, filled the air with smoke and invention. Their craft was immense yet hurried. It lacked the stillness that once let the work sing through the worker. And still, Lugh loved them. He loved their striving, their endless curiosity, even when it outran wisdom. He had taught them skill. He could not now deny them their yearning to surpass even the gods. Now and then, when the world forgot beauty in its hunger for speed, he would stir. His presence would ripple faintly through the fabric of time, and for a moment some forgotten gentleness would awaken. A craftsman, weary of noise, would lay aside his tools and listen to rain against a window. A child, playing in the dust of a factory road, would look toward the horizon and feel wonder without knowing why. A poet would stop mid-line, close her eyes, and sense that every word she sought already existed somewhere beyond her. These were his quiet returns, small, human, sufficient. But the sea remembers its children, and so the waves still bore his essence along their endless routes. In the hush between tides, fishermen swore they sometimes saw a shape of gold beneath the surface. Others spoke of hearing music that came from nowhere, a harp sounding just beyond sight. Those who followed the sound found safer waters, their nets full, their hearts untroubled. They left offerings of bread and ale upon the shore, not knowing whom they thanked. Lugh heard, and his heart softened further into the sea. He had once been a god of mastery, of blazing skill that no rival could equal. Now he was something humbler, more complete, the quiet after mastery, the peace of the craft perfected and released. Still, as every tide returns to the shore, so too must every story find its next beginning. One morning, long after the world had forgotten how to listen, a young woman walked alone upon the western cliffs. She was a painter, though she did not yet call herself one. Her village was small, her days filled with labour and silence. She came here when she could, seeking something she could not name, the space between her breath and the horizon. That day the sky was heavy with mist, the sea below restless but not cruel. She sat upon a rock and set her easel before her, but her hand hesitated above the blank canvas. "What colour is light?" she whispered. The question drifted out into the fog and vanished, or so she thought. A moment later, a voice as soft as tide foam answered, though whether in her ear or her mind she could not tell. All of them, and none. Light is what reveals the colour, not what is coloured. She turned, startled, but saw no one, only the sea, vast and breathing. Yet something changed within her, a sudden stillness, a knowing that felt both ancient and intimate. Her hand began to move. When she finished, the mist had lifted. Upon her canvas was no sea, no sky, no form she could name, only a radiance that seemed to pulse from within the paint, a shimmer like memory itself. She stared at it, tears rising without reason. That evening she carried the painting home, and those who saw it said it seemed to glow faintly in moonlight. They called it the Shining One. From beneath the waves Lugh smiled. The world, it seemed, still found ways to remember him, through craft, through creation, through the quiet ache of beauty. In that smile was both farewell and faith. He knew that someday even oceans would sleep, that stars themselves would fade. But as long as one being anywhere in creation sought to make rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, his light would live within that act. He closed his eyes, and the sea moved over him like breath. The currents hummed softly, carrying his essence through coral and current, into shells, into foam, into the smallest glint of light upon a wave. He became the shimmer itself. The instant before dawn touches the world, when everything is still possible. He was not gone. He had simply become everything that remembered how to begin again. The sea breathed him out again in its own time, for nothing in creation truly disappears. The waves that had carried him westward began, after a long age of silence, to bring his spirit back, not as a man, not even as a god, but as presence. He returned in whispers, in reflections, in the moments between moments. His was now the patience of the world itself. In the hush before dawn, when the tide slid back from the sand, a low shimmer sometimes rippled across the water, like sunlight beneath the surface. To those still enough to see, it looked as if the sea were remembering something, a promise kept too long unspoken. Fishermen, waking early, would pause mid-motion, their nets limp in their hands, hearts stilled by a feeling they could not name. They would bow their heads, and though they knew no prayer for him any more, they whispered thanks to the quiet light upon the sea. Lugh's consciousness moved through all things now, an invisible current in every gesture of creation. When a carpenter smoothed a beam and paused to admire the grain, that pause was his. When a mother sang to her child and found the melody rising unbidden from memory, that melody was his. When the first golden shaft of morning slid across a window pane and turned the dust to tiny worlds of light, he was there in that golden briefness. He no longer thought as he once had. Thought had dissolved into being. There was no separation between what he was and what he touched. The wind moving through grass, the ring of a hammer, the brushstroke finding its line, all were Lugh, and none were. Yet the land itself began, in its own dreaming, to remember him again. The people changed, centuries shifting like weather, and though their tongues forgot the old forms, they kept the sense of something benevolent within the light. They built small shrines at wells and stones, places where water and rock met like thought and form. There they left flowers, coins, whispered wishes. They did not name him, yet they called upon what he had become, the quiet goodness that watches over work, that steadies the hand and soothes the heart. In summer, when the first barley bowed beneath the wind, they still held games, running, wrestling, feasting. They no longer spoke of gods at all, yet laughter rose the same way it had when the Tuatha Dé Danann danced the world's first dances. Every shout, every cheer was a pulse of the life he'd given back to the earth. He was not their master now, he was their momentum. Sometimes, on the edge of evening, a child would wander alone through the fields and see a figure standing where the sunlight met the mist. A tall man, golden-haired, his face too bright to see clearly. The child would not be afraid. The figure would lift a hand as though in blessing and then fade with the turning of the light. The child would run home breathless, trying to describe what they'd seen, but no words would quite fit. Only one would remain in their memory, spoken, softly, as if it had been whispered to them. Balance. And so the story endured, not as scripture, but as rhythm. For though the gods of old had passed beyond the veil of myth, the truths they embodied remained folded into the pattern of being. Lugh was not a name now, but a law of existence, that light must learn gentleness, that skill must serve harmony, that dawn is not conquest over night, but its completion. There came an age when scholars would study the old myths again. They would open weathered manuscripts, read of the Shining One, of Balor and the Tuatha Dé Danann, of battles fought and worlds renewed. They would speak of him as symbol, light against shadow, intellect against tyranny, and they would miss, as scholars often do, the simplest thing, that the story was still happening. For even as they wrote, light poured through their windows, illuminating the ink, guiding their pens. Even then, Lugh's patience watched over them, his brightness held within the small acts of care that make knowledge endure. And when they closed their books at dusk, when they looked toward the west and saw the sky burn gold before fading into blue, something within them always softened. They would linger for a breath, feeling the world balance itself between day and night, understanding without thought that they were witnessing not the end of light, but its rest. That was his gift, the serenity that follows understanding, the peace that comes after mastery. It is said in certain quiet places that he walks still, not upon the earth, but within it, through the sap of trees, the shimmer of rivers, the pulse beneath mountains. When a craftsman hums while he works, when a teacher smiles at a child's first success, when a stranger helps another without knowing why, there is his step, his breath, his everlasting dawn. And sometimes, rarely, when the world grows very still at the edge of morning, one might hear a sound far off over the water, a single clear note of harp music, rising and fading like a sigh. It is not loud. It asks for nothing. It is simply there, as reminder and promise, that what was born of light cannot be unmade by shadow. So the story of Lugh, the Shining One, becomes not an ending but a rhythm that endures. It is the rhythm of all creation, the slow turning from night into day, from sorrow into learning, from effort into grace. It is the endless whisper at the heart of all things. Begin again. The sun lifts, the sea exhales, the world breathes anew. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where sky and ocean mingle, the light that was once a god moves gently on the wind, still shining, still remembering, still enough. When the sea and the sky learned to share the same colour, when the air grew quiet enough that even the stones seemed to listen, the world entered what would later be called an age of forgetting. It was not a deliberate forgetting, nor cruel. It was simply the way of time. Names fade, faces soften, and what once was sacred becomes ordinary through familiarity. Yet in that ordinariness something holy persisted. Lugh's light did not blaze anymore. It glowed quietly beneath things, beneath the weight of a potter's wheel turning steady in the dim light of dawn, beneath the hush of wind over peat fields, beneath the heartbeat of a blacksmith tapping rhythm into iron. The world no longer spoke his name, but it lived his name. In the corners of old villages, people still paused at thresholds to bow their heads, murmuring gratitude before stepping out into the morning. They did not know why. They simply felt that to begin the day without a moment of reverence was to begin unbalanced. At wells and rivers, children still tossed pebbles into the water and made wishes, though they no longer knew whom they addressed. And in every home, in every firelight that softened a tired face, in every story told to chase away the dark, his spirit listened. It was enough. But there were still nights, long, silent, moonless nights, when the world trembled in its sleep. Storms would rise out of nowhere, fierce and sudden, and travellers would whisper that the sea was remembering something it could not let go. On such nights, if one stood upon the western cliffs, the wind carried voices, not angry, but ancient. The murmuring of the Fomorians deep below, the endless conversation between shadow and light. And sometimes, among those voices, another tone would emerge, a thread of warmth that wove through the storm and gentled it. It was not command, but compassion. The waves would still, the clouds would loosen their grip upon the moon, and dawn would arrive as if it had never been gone. That was Lugh, soothing the old darkness, reminding it that it too had a place. For even shadow must rest somewhere, and he had long since ceased to see it as his enemy. In one quiet village near the coast, there lived an old woman who kept to herself. She spun wool by her hearth and spoke to no one except the sea. People called her mad, though kindly. Every evening she would light a small lamp and place it by the window. When asked why, she would only say, "So he can find his way home." No one knew whom she meant, but the lamp burned faithfully year after year. One winter night, as snow drifted thick across the land and all the world lay wrapped in silence, the lamp flickered low. The woman leaned forward to trim its wick, her hands trembling with age. As she did, a warmth passed through the room, a stillness that was not air, but presence. She looked up, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure tall and radiant, clothed not in splendour, but in soft light. He smiled at her with eyes that held both dawn and dusk. "You kept the light," he said. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. "Someone had to," she whispered. He knelt beside her, his hand warm upon hers. "You have done my work better than I ever could," he said gently. "You have kept faith with the living." "Are you—" She hesitated, afraid to speak the word she had long forgotten. "I am only what you remember," he said, "and what you remember is enough." When morning came, the neighbours found the lamp still burning, its flame steady. The old woman sat peacefully beside it, her face serene, her eyes closed as if she were listening to some distant music. They buried her on the hill overlooking the sea, and the lamp was placed beside her grave. For years after, sailors swore they saw its glow from far offshore, a small, constant light guiding them home through fog and night. They called it the Widow's Star. Lugh watched from the horizon, where the sea met the sun, and smiled. He knew now that the world did not need him to walk it. It needed only to remember warmth in the cold. Ages passed. Empires rose and fell. New names for the sacred took root, but they were all branches of the same ancient tree. The people still celebrated when the harvest came, still gathered when the days grew long. They still honoured craft and care, though they no longer spoke the old words for them. Yet in every song of gratitude, in every light kindled against the dark, his essence flickered. Humble, eternal. Sometimes a poet, lost in thought, would pause over an unfinished line and feel a sudden clarity, as though a hand of sunlight had brushed across his mind. Sometimes a healer, weary from tending the sick, would look at her hands and sense a strength not her own, urging her to continue. And sometimes, when the world itself seemed heavy with sorrow, a dawn would break so soft and golden that even the birds fell silent in its presence. That dawn was him, the memory of renewal, the whisper that all endings are beginnings in disguise. There would come a day, far in the distance of time, when even stories themselves would fade, when the last tongue to speak his name would fall still. But Lugh had no fear of that, for he had learned the oldest truth of all, that the purpose of light is not to be remembered, but to make remembering possible. And so he remained, not as a god to be worshipped, nor even as a legend to be retold, but as a quiet pattern in the weave of all existence, the steady rhythm beneath creation's pulse, the warmth behind every act of grace, the shimmer that lingers in the moment between breath and word, between dusk and dawn, between forgetting and awakening. On the last night of the age, when time itself would sigh and fold back into silence, the sea would once again glow softly. From its heart a single note of harp music would rise, the same sound that had begun all things, a promise that the light that teaches, the light that heals, the light that waits, is never gone, and when that note fades, the world will exhale in peace. It is said that when the world grows quiet enough, when even the restless heart of humankind pauses between one thought and the next, a different kind of hearing begins, the hearing that does not come through ears, but through the soul's remembering. In such stillness, the story of Lugh continues. The world had moved far beyond the days of his walking. The people who tilled the land no longer built with stone, but with steel and glass. The fires that once warmed their nights now burned in invisible currents of energy that hummed through wires beneath their feet. Cities rose like mountains of light, each window a small sun. The darkness of the night sky grew thin, washed pale by 1,000 glittering lamps. Yet amid all that brightness, the ancient balance began again to whisper. Lugh felt it from wherever he now dwelt, not apart from the world, but within its motion. His essence had long dissolved into the air, the sea, the soil. He had become what the poets might one day call memory itself. But memory, when neglected, aches to be reawakened. He sensed the ache. Human hands still made and built and dreamed, but the crafts had changed. Where once a smith had learned the patience of metal, now machines did the work in seconds. Where once a healer listened to the rhythm of breath, now voices called through glass screens, speaking faster than the heart could follow. The light that had been his gift was everywhere, so abundant that few remembered its source or its gentleness. And yet, even here, he found beauty. He found it in the child who watched raindrops chase one another down a window pane, seeing worlds within each shimmer. He found it in the musician who closed her eyes between notes, letting silence breathe through her. He found it in the painter who, beneath the din of the city, still waited for the right light before beginning. These were his kin, the quiet keepers of balance who did not know they kept it. One night, in a vast city beside the sea, a young architect stood on the roof of an unfinished tower. The wind was cold, the tide far below glittered with scattered reflections of human light. He felt both proud and hollow. The world below him thrummed with energy, yet he could not shake the sense that something essential had slipped away. His designs were praised, his name known, but he longed for something older, steadier, a beauty that was not measured in height or power. He leaned against the railing, eyes on the horizon where the sea met the stars, and whispered, "What is it I'm missing?" The wind shifted. He did not see the figure appear beside him, only felt it, like warmth spreading gently through the air. A voice, calm and luminous, spoke just above the sound of the waves. "You are missing the silence within the making." The architect turned. The man beside him was simple in form, tall, bare-handed, his hair the colour of morning. There was no blinding radiance, only a softness that seemed to bring every colour around them into harmony. "Who are you?" he asked, though the question felt smaller than the answer he already sensed. "Someone who once thought the world could be healed by mastery," said the stranger, smiling faintly, "and who learned, in time, that the world heals itself when touched with care." They stood together for a while, saying nothing. Below, the city murmured like a restless sea. Above, the clouds drifted apart, revealing a single bright star. "Do you ever tire of it?" the architect asked quietly. "Of reminding us?" Lugh's gaze lingered on the horizon. Light does not tire, it simply waits. The young man nodded, not quite understanding, but feeling peace settle in him nonetheless. When he looked again, the stranger was gone, and the city seemed softer, the wind gentler. He would never speak of that meeting, but afterward his buildings changed. They grew less grand, more graceful, places that breathed with their surroundings rather than conquering them. Those who entered them often said they felt strangely calm inside, as though the walls themselves remembered kindness. Thus the Shining One's touch returned once more, unseen but certain. Through the years that followed, his presence moved quietly through human creation. In every act of art that sought not praise but truth, in every invention that served rather than consumed, in every song that made the heart ache with recognition, there was Lugh. Not as a being above, but as a current within, the still point at the centre of all endeavour. Sometimes, in rare hours between dusk and dawn, those who laboured long in devotion to their craft, be it a sculptor at her clay, a physician at his patient's side, a teacher lingering over a child's drawing, would feel a warmth behind them, as though someone stood close, watching with love. A whisper seemed to brush their thoughts. "Well done. Continue." They never knew its source, but the work that followed always carried a new radiance. So the world went on, lit not by miracles, but by moments, by the grace that enters whenever light remembers to be gentle, and in the deep places where the ocean meets its own reflection, where no wave breaks and no wind reaches, there drifts the stillness that once had a name. The sea hums its low eternal hymn, and within it Lugh rests, awake and dreaming both, part of the pattern he began. When the earth trembles, when the sun flares, when the stars are born and die, his presence remains unchanged. For he is no longer the god who fought or ruled. He is the quiet law of renewal itself, the rhythm that turns endings into beginnings. And perhaps, when all lights fade and the last dawn of the world rises, he will walk once more upon the shore. Not to save, not to command, but to greet, to lift his face to the final sunrise and whisper, as he always has, "Begin again." The horizon will open before him, the sea breathing out one last time, and the light of every age will gather round his form. Then, softly, as if exhaling peace into all creation, he will step into that radiance, not vanishing, but becoming it. And the world, warmed by his passing, will understand that it has never truly been without him. When the last of night fell away and the first tremor of new light crept over the rim of the world, the air held that stillness which belongs only to the edge of eternity, the moment between what has been and what will be. The sea stretched endless and silver beneath that awakening, and somewhere within its luminous vastness drifted the breath of the Shining One. He did not return in form, he did not need to. His being had become so interwoven with the life of all things that to separate him would have been to unmake harmony itself. Yet within that unity, a flicker of awareness stirred, a recognition not of time, but of readiness. He felt the heartbeat of the earth beneath the deep, slow as memory, constant as tide. He felt the turning of galaxies above, vast and serene. Between those immensities moved humankind, restless, seeking, endlessly beginning. He felt their fear, their courage, their hunger for meaning, and their small, shining acts of kindness, still quietly burning amidst all noise. Each of those acts, he realized, was a spark of him, the craft of the soul. And so, though no eye could see him, he began to rise. The sea did not break, it parted with reverence. Light gathered not in rays but in ripples, as though dawn were remembering how to move. From that radiance a figure emerged, not a god as in the old days, but something gentler, more human, shaped of water and firelight and memory. His eyes held the calm of centuries, yet within them glimmered the wonder of first morning. He stepped upon the shore, grass bent beneath his feet, and where he walked, dew turned briefly to gold before sinking back into the soil. The air itself seemed to breathe around him. Every living thing paused, not in fear, but in awareness, as though the world were listening to its own heartbeat and finding it good. He looked upon the horizon and smiled. The world had changed beyond all knowing. Cities and forests braided together, rivers tamed and released, voices carried through invisible threads of wind. Yet beneath all that change the same pulse remained, the desire to make, to heal, to connect. He whispered into the dawn, "They have not forgotten." A voice answered, soft as tide foam, Mananans, though distant now, diffused through every wave. "They never will. The pattern you began continues. You are in every act of renewal." "I am in them," said Lugh quietly, "and they are in me. That is enough." He walked inland, following a path that shimmered faintly where morning touched it. The land was rich with scent. Grass, stone, salt, the sweetness of new leaves. He could feel the memory of all he had known here, the laughter of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the clang of the forges, the songs of harvest and homecoming. The years had folded them into myth, yet their essence remained in the wind. He came at last to a hill overlooking the fields, one of those quiet, nameless hills where no monument stands, only sky and silence. There he paused, gazing down upon the world. In the villages below, people stirred to begin their day, a baker lighting her oven, a shepherd opening the pen, a child running barefoot through dew. None saw him, yet he felt their hearts moving in rhythm with the earth. Each pulse, each breath, each small kindness was a thread in the same eternal weave. He understood then what his long journey had been for. Not victory, not glory, not even peace, but presence. to bring light into being not by shining alone, but by teaching others how to shine. He closed his eyes and lifted his face to the rising sun. Its warmth touched him like a hand in blessing, and within that touch, all boundaries dissolved. The god, the man, the legend, the light, they became one and the same. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the land, and where it touched him, his form grew brighter until it was no longer separate from the air. For a moment his silhouette lingered, a figure of radiance standing upon the hill, serene and still. Then it faded, absorbed into the morning. But the light remained, settling over the fields, over the rivers, over the sleeping hearts of humankind. It was not the brilliance of fire or the command of gods. It was gentler, deeper, the kind of light that teaches eyes how to see anew. And from that day onward, the world carried his quiet wisdom in every dawn. Farmers rose with it, children played beneath it, artists waited for it to fall upon their work. It became the language of beginnings. At midsummer, when the sun hung longest in the sky, people still gathered without knowing why. They feasted, they raced, they built fires on the hills, the flames danced upward, meeting the lingering daylight, and for a heartbeat the two seemed one, the fire of the earth greeting the fire of the heavens. Someone would always raise a cup and say, "To the light," and laughter would follow, bright and free. They never named him, but he was there, smiling through every spark. And so Lugh endured, not as a memory of the past, but as the rhythm that carries the world forward, the eternal motion of creation made gentle. When night falls now, and the stars kindle their ancient fires, listen closely. Between their shining and the silence that holds them, there is a pulse, soft, steady, infinite. It is the heartbeat of all beginnings, the quiet joy of every skill born of care. It is the breath of Lugh, still moving through the world. And if you stand at the window at dawn, and the light seems to wait an instant before touching your face, know that he is there greeting you. Not as God, not as myth, but as reminder that light is not something found, but something we become. For the story of the Shining One has no end. It only deepens as morning does when it meets the sea. It is said that every ending, when told rightly, carries within it a hush that belongs to beginnings. And so it was that the story of Lugh, the bright one, the master of every craft, the light that learned to rest, drew toward its quiet close. Not the end of his being, for light does not end, but the settling of his tale into the stillness it had earned. The day of that settling dawned as softly as breath on glass. Across the hills of Ireland, mists rose in ribbons of silver and pearl. Rivers murmured under thin veils of fog, fields glistened with dew that caught the newborn sun. The air was full of gentle sound, grazing cattle, turning leaves, the whisper of a spinning wheel from some distant cottage. All ordinary things, yet somehow luminous. From the western sea a breeze moved inland, carrying the faint scent of salt and the deeper rhythm of tides. It passed through forests, over stones carved by forgotten hands, through doorways and hearth smoke, until it reached the highest hill. There it lingered, as though pausing to listen. If one had been there, one might have seen him. Lugh, no longer radiant with unbearable brilliance, but luminous as early morning. The light that shaped him was the light that lives in all things when they are fully themselves. His hair shone with no more fire than ripened wheat. His eyes held the colour of dawn reflected in still water. He stood in silence for a long while, looking out across the land. The valleys below were threaded with rivers that gleamed like spun silver. Villages rested like beads upon the earth's green garment. Smoke curled from chimneys, rising to meet the brightening sky. Everywhere he looked there was balance, the old peace he had long sought. Not perfect, not eternal, but true enough to breathe in. He spoke quietly to the wind. It is finished, not by ending, but by understanding. From somewhere unseen came the soft answering murmur of Manannan's voice, the sea's eternal echo. "And what will you do now, bright one?" Lugh smiled, a small and human smile. "I will walk until I am only light." The wind touched him then, tender as a blessing. It wove through his form, loosening him thread by thread. He did not resist. His edges shimmered, became haze, became warmth. The hill, the grass, the world seemed to breathe him in, and in that breath he found peace. For light, he understood at last, is not a crown to be worn nor a flame to be guarded. It is a gift meant to pass through. When it meets resistance, it burns. When it is allowed to flow, it heals. He had been both fire and flow. Now he was only the latter. His voice, before it faded, was a whisper carried by the wind. May skill be gentle. May courage be kind. May every dawn be soft upon your eyes. Then silence. The hill was empty once more, though the grass still bowed as if remembering his passing. The sun climbed higher, spilling radiance across the land. In the village below, a woman stepped. Outside her door, her hands wrapped in linen from the loom. She paused, feeling warmth on her face that seemed to hold something more than weather. She smiled without knowing why and went to hang her cloth in the light. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a harp string hummed of its own accord. Somewhere a craftsman paused in his work and found his hand steadier than before. The day went on, simple and shining. And thus the Shining One remained, not above the world, not apart, but through it. He was in the silence between words, in the calm beneath effort, in the tenderness that lingers after understanding. He was the grace in skill, the rest in music, the glint on the wave. When night came, the stars kindled gently, each one a memory of his light scattered through the heavens. The moon lifted slow over the horizon, silver and solemn, and the sea answered with a soft exhale. In that vast and tranquil harmony, the world slept unafraid. For the light was not gone. It had merely gone home, to the heart of all things, where it had always belonged. There are endings that fade like dusk, and there are endings that unfold like breath. Soft, continuous, and full of life that refuses to leave. The story of Lugh was one such ending. It did not close. It exhaled. In the quiet that followed his final step into the morning, the land itself seemed to settle. The wind eased into gentler patterns, carrying warmth instead of chill. The rivers ran clearer. Even the shadows grew kind, holding the light instead of resisting it. Ireland, that old and dreaming land, seemed at peace not because the god was gone, but because he had finally become inseparable from all that endured. At the edge of the sea, where the foam sighs against stone, travellers still paused without knowing why. Some felt a sudden calm there, others an ache that was not sadness but remembering. The sea at twilight glowed faintly with that same colour that once crowned Lugh's brow. Gold tempered by grey, light that had learned tenderness, and sometimes, when the waves hushed for just a moment between breaths, it was possible to hear the faintest sound, one note of a harp, rising and falling with the tide. It was never loud enough to prove, never certain enough to capture, but it was there, carrying the quiet message that had been his since the beginning. Light is not victory, it is balance. Creation is not command, it is care. Generations passed. The old myths melted into the air, worn smooth by centuries of retelling. The names of gods became hills and rivers and stars. Yet wherever hands built, healed, wrote, sang, or simply reached toward one another, Lugh's light flickered. It was no longer a presence to be worshipped, but a rhythm to be lived. In that rhythm, the world found its resting heartbeat. One evening, long after time had blurred the boundaries of ages, a child stood upon a hillside as twilight gathered. Her family had gone down to the village, but she lingered, fascinated by how the last rays of sunlight turned the grass to threads of bronze. She lifted her hand and tried to catch the glow between her fingers. "Don't fade yet," she whispered. "Stay a little longer." The wind stirred, brushing her hair from her face, and a voice, so gentle it could have been her own thought, answered, "I do not fade, I become." She turned, but there was only the hill, the sky, and the deepening gold of evening. Yet the air around her felt warm, as though someone kind stood just beyond sight. She smiled, sensing she was part of something vast and kind and endlessly turning. When she ran down the hill, she looked back once. For an instant, just where the sun met the horizon, she thought she saw a figure standing there, a shape woven of light and air, looking toward the sea. The figure lifted a hand, not in farewell, but in greeting. Then it dissolved into the sunset, and the sea answered with a long, calm breath. That night, the child dreamed of a world woven entirely of dawn. She saw hands crafting stars, voices building rivers, light folding into itself and being born again. At the centre of it all was the same presence she had felt upon the hill, neither man nor god, but the essence of making and unmaking, the serenity that lives inside becoming. When she woke, she remembered none of the dream, only a feeling, a deep peace that lasted through her whole life. In her art, her kindness, her patience, the rhythm of the Shining One endured, and so it continues. Every dawn that follows night, every skill that becomes love, every heart that chooses gentleness over pride, is part of that same unending song. The story of Lugh is not written in words or stone, but in the daily courage of creation, in every breath that says begin again. The hills still hold his quiet, the rivers still hum his melody, the morning still carries his peace, and if you listen closely, at the turning of light, you might feel it too, that soft ancient certainty that everything made in care becomes eternal. Somewhere beyond the horizon, where sky meets sea, the Shining One walks still, not apart from us, but within the light that greets each dawn. His story does not end. It rests, as the world rests between day and night in the harmony he gave it. The air sighs, the sea glimmers, the earth breathes, and the light, the soft, endless light, remains.